He had always believed that peace was something you had to earn. For most of his life, he had known only noise. The sound of helicopters, gunfire in the distance, orders shouted through radios. When he finally left that world behind, he promised himself he would live quietly, far away from anything that reminded him of what he used to be. He bought a small house at the edge of a quiet town, a place where people still waved at each other across fences and kids rode bicycles down the middle of the road. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe. There were trees around his yard, a small porch that caught the morning sun, and a patch of grass where his dog loved to lie down. The dog's name was Shadow. A Belgian Malinois, strong and smart, with eyes that always seemed to be watching everything. Shadow had been more than just a pet. He had been his partner during years of missions no one ever talked about. They had trusted each other completely. In the field, Shadow had saved his life more than once. Now in this quiet town, Shadow was the only one who understood the silence that followed him everywhere. Each morning before the world woke up, the man and his dog walked down the empty streets. He liked to move before sunrise when the air was still cool and no one asked questions. He would throw a ball, let Shadow chase it, and watch the dog run like he was built for freedom. Sometimes neighbors waved from their porches, smiling at the sight of a man and his loyal dog. He always nodded back but rarely stopped to talk. People knew little about him, only that he was polite, quiet, and seemed to keep to himself. The truth was, he didn't want to stand out. After years of being someone whose job depended on invisibility, blending in came naturally. He spent his days fixing things around the house, taking long walks, reading old books, and training Shadow to stay sharp. It wasn't the kind of life that made headlines, but it was a life that let him breathe. There were moments when the past tried to catch up, the sudden pop of fireworks on a summer night, or the whir of a helicopter overhead. In those moments, his body would tense before his mind even realized it. Shadow would sense it too, sitting close beside him, calm and steady. It was like the dog knew exactly how to pull him back to the present. Neighbors often saw them together and admired how well-trained Shadow was. Children pointed and laughed when Shadow caught the ball mid-air, or obeyed a quiet command with perfect timing. Some people asked how he got the dog to listen so well, and he would just smile and say, "Patience and trust." That was all he ever said. He didn't talk about the long years of training, or the countless missions where silence could mean survival. He didn't talk about what it felt like to come home and not know who he was anymore. Those stories belonged to another world, a world he had left behind the day he came home for good. The town felt safe. Everyone seemed to know everyone. The lady next door often brought over fresh bread, and the mailman liked to stop for a quick hello. Even the local police drove by sometimes, giving friendly nods as they passed. It was a simple life, the kind he had never thought he'd get to live. Shadow had a special way of bringing light into it. Every time the man felt distant, Shadow would nudge his hand with his nose or drop a ball at his feet. It was as if the dog refused to let him drift too far into his thoughts. In many ways, Shadow wasn't just his companion. He was his connection to normal life. One afternoon, he decided to take Shadow to the small field near the edge of town. It was a wide open space surrounded by tall grass and trees, a place where Shadow could run free. The man took off the leash and let him go. Shadow dashed across the field, circling back and forth, stopping only to make sure his owner was still watching. He stood there, smiling quietly, hands in his pockets. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt right. No noise, no chaos, just a man and his dog under a wide blue sky. Back home, the days followed a comfortable rhythm. He'd wake early, brew coffee, and sit on the porch while Shadow lay by his feet. The morning smelled of pine and wet soil. Sometimes a car would pass by and he'd give a polite nod. Other times he'd just sit there for hours thinking about nothing at all. He liked it that way. After so many years of living on the edge, there was something beautiful about boredom. But peace has a fragile way of existing. It can be shattered by something small, something that seems harmless at first. It began with a new family that moved into the neighborhood. They were nice people, young with 2 kids and a small dog. The man introduced himself when he saw them moving in, helped carry a few boxes, and welcomed them to the street. Everything seemed fine, but their dog, a tiny white one with more bark than bite, never got along with Shadow. Every time the two were outside, the smaller dog barked endlessly, while Shadow stood calmly watching but never reacting. The kids next door were fascinated by Shadow. They often leaned over the fence, calling out to him, trying to pet him through the gaps. Shadow didn't mind, but the man always reminded them gently, "Don't get too close when I'm not around, okay? He listens to me, but he's trained to protect." The kids nodded, but they didn't always listen. One morning, while the man was running errands in town, something happened. A delivery truck pulled up to his house, and the driver left the gate slightly open. Shadow, hearing the noise, wandered outside. It wasn't unusual for him to patrol the yard. He never went far. But with the gate open, he walked to the sidewalk, sniffing around like any curious dog. A neighbor, seeing a large dog loose, got nervous. They didn't recognize Shadow right away and thought he might be a stray. They called animal control, who passed the call to the local police. Within minutes, a patrol car was driving slowly down the street. People came out to watch. Someone pointed toward the dog, saying, "That's the one." Shadow stood still, ears perked, not aggressive, just alert. When the man returned home later, everything looked normal at first. The truck was gone. The neighborhood was quiet. He parked his car and called for Shadow. No answer. He called again. Nothing. His stomach tightened. He walked around the house, checked the backyard. The gate was open. He looked down at the grass and saw faint tire marks near the edge of the road. Then he saw the small orange marker tied to the fence, a sign animal control sometimes left to show they had responded to a call. He felt a rush of worry, the kind that made his chest heavy. He called the local shelter, hoping they had picked Shadow up. The voice on the phone hesitated before answering. "Sir, I think you should come down here," they said softly. He didn't ask more. He just grabbed his keys and drove. As he walked into the shelter, the smell of disinfectant hit him. The front desk worker looked up and gave a small, uneasy smile. "You're here about the Belgian Malinois?" "Yes," he said quietly. The worker's expression changed, sympathy mixed with discomfort. She looked down for a moment before saying, "There was an incident. We were told the dog acted aggressive when officers approached. They thought—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. He didn't move for several seconds. The words didn't feel real. Aggressive? Shadow had been trained for discipline. He'd seen explosions without flinching. He had never harmed anyone. The worker offered to take him to see where they had brought the dog, but he shook his head. He didn't need to see. The silence that filled him said enough. Driving home, the world felt smaller. Every house looked the same, every tree cast the same shadow. But the one thing that had made his home feel alive was gone. That night, he sat on the porch with the leash still in his hand. The air felt heavy. He didn't cry. Not because he didn't want to, but because the part of him that once felt pain like that had learned to bury it deep. He looked out at the yard, remembering all the mornings Shadow had raced across it. He told himself it was just a mistake. The police didn't know. They couldn't have. To them, it was just another call, another potential threat. They had no idea who the owner was. They had no idea that the man sitting in that small, quiet house had once been part of a team, whose skills could change the course of entire operations overseas. But none of that mattered now. The man wasn't that person anymore. He didn't want revenge. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted his dog back. The one being in the world who had stood by him through everything. He sat there until the sun came up, the leash still resting across his lap. And as the morning light crept across the yard, something inside him shifted. The piece he had built so carefully now had a crack running through it, one that would never fully heal. He didn't know it yet, but this small, quiet loss would soon pull him back into a world he thought he had left behind for good. The next morning, the house felt heavier than ever. The man woke early as usual, but the silence was different now. No sound of paws on the floor, no familiar tail thumping against the wall, no eager eyes waiting by the door. The leash still hung by the window, and for a moment he almost reached for it out of habit. But then the truth hit him again, like a quiet echo that refused to fade. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. The sun was rising slowly outside, painting a soft glow across the empty backyard. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same. People often said time healed everything, but he knew better. Some wounds didn't close, and they just sank deeper, hidden beneath the surface where no one could see them. Later that morning, he decided to walk into town. He told himself it was to clear his head, but really, He didn't want to sit alone in that house anymore. The familiar streets felt different now, colder, quieter, even though life around him went on as usual. Cars passed, kids laughed near the park, shopkeepers opened their doors. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. When he reached the local store, a few neighbors waved at him. He smiled politely, the way people do when they don't want to talk about what's really on their minds. One of them asked, "Hey, where's Shadow today? Haven't seen him in a few days." For a second, he couldn't find the words. He just nodded slowly and said, "He's gone." The neighbor frowned. "Gone? You mean he ran away?" He shook his head. "No, he's gone." His voice was calm, but there was something final in it that made the neighbor step back slightly, unsure what to say next. He didn't blame them. How could they understand? To them it was just a dog. To him it was everything. As he walked home, his thoughts started to turn toward the incident. He kept replaying it in his mind. The open gate, the call to the police, the orange marker on the fence. It didn't add up. Shadow had never been a threat to anyone. He wondered what exactly the officers saw that made them act so quickly. Was Shadow barking? Was he scared? Did they even try to check whose dog he was? That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind restless. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that there had to be more to the story. The next day, he went to the local police station. He didn't go there to cause trouble, he just wanted answers. The front desk officer looked up as he walked in. "Good morning, sir. Can I help you?" "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm here about a call from 2 days ago. You responded to an animal report on Oak Ridge Street." The officer typed something into the computer and nodded. "Right, yes. The report says there was a large dog acting aggressively. Officers arrived and handled the situation. Is there a problem?" He took a slow breath. "That dog was mine. His name was Shadow." The officer's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. It looks like everything was done according to protocol." He nodded again, but his eyes didn't leave the officer's. "Was there body cam footage?" The officer hesitated. "There should be, yes. But those recordings aren't something we can release without a formal request." He thanked the officer and walked out. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show anger. Years of discipline had taught him how to keep emotion buried when it mattered. But inside, something was starting to stir. A quiet determination that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with truth. Over the next few days, he started to notice little things. Some neighbors avoided eye contact. Others whispered when he passed. A few came by to offer sympathy, but their words felt hollow. "It's such a shame," they said. "I'm sure they didn't mean any harm." He nodded politely. But every word felt like another reminder that Shadow's life had been reduced to a mistake. A small, forgettable line in a report. He began to visit the field where he and Shadow used to train. It was peaceful there. He'd sit on the grass, listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes he imagined hearing Shadow's bark echoing faintly, as if the dog was still out there, waiting for another command. As the days passed, he found himself watching the world more closely again. It was a habit from his old life, noticing details others missed. The same police car that drove by every evening now slowed down near his house. A new face appeared at the end of the street, pretending to jog but stopping too often to tie his shoes. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just his mind trying to fill the silence. But old instincts die hard. One afternoon, while sitting on his porch, he saw one of the officers who had been at the scene. The man was talking to another neighbor, laughing casually, completely unaware of who was watching. The sight stirred something inside him, not anger but a kind of disbelief. How easily people moved on. That night he wrote down everything he remembered about the day Shadow was taken. Times, details, even the color of the vehicles that came. He didn't know what he was going to do with the information, but writing it helped him think clearly. He started asking quiet questions around town. Not the kind that drew attention, just small, harmless ones. "Do you remember hearing anything that morning? Did you see anyone from animal control? Did anyone take pictures?" Slowly, he pieced together fragments of the story. A neighbor across the street mentioned that Shadow wasn't acting aggressive at all. He was just sitting near the curb when the police arrived. Another person said they saw one officer raise his hand as if to calm the dog, but then everything happened too fast. The man listened carefully, never interrupting. When they asked what he planned to do, he only said, "Nothing yet." He knew how fragile reputations could be. One wrong word could turn a small town story into a storm. And he didn't want that, not yet. He just wanted honesty. The following week, he drove to the city and filed a formal request for the body cam footage. The clerk behind the counter gave him a tired smile and said it could take several weeks to process. He thanked her and left. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing. Each day after that felt longer than the last. The world kept turning, but for him, everything had slowed down. He went through his daily routine, fixing things, reading, walking. But now there was a quiet tension in everything he did. It wasn't anger exactly. It was focus. The same kind of focus that once kept him alive in places most people would never understand. One evening, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was from the police department, confirming his request had been approved. He could view the footage at their office the following week. That night, for the first time in days, he slept. Not peacefully, but with a kind of weary relief that came from knowing he was finally going to see the truth for himself. When the day arrived, he dressed neatly, as he always did, calm, composed. The officer assigned to him led him into a small room with a screen and a folder of files. The footage began. He watched as the patrol car pulled up to his street. He saw a shadow in the frame and standing still, tail low, looking more curious than dangerous. The officers got out, talking quietly to each other. He could hear one of them say, "Let's approach slowly." Shadow barked once, not a threatening bark, just a sharp sound of alertness. Then came the part that made his hands tighten slightly. One officer moved forward too quickly and Shadow took a step back. The other officer shouted something unclear, and the sound that followed made the man close his eyes for a moment. The screen went black. The room was silent. The officer who had shown him the footage shifted uncomfortably. "It all happened fast," he said quietly. "They thought he was going to attack." The man nodded slowly. "He wasn't," he said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. When he left the station, the air outside felt sharp and cool. He stood there for a long moment looking at the horizon. It wasn't about blame anymore. It was about what was right. He began to think carefully about what to do next. He knew how to handle things quietly without drawing attention, but this was different. This wasn't a mission. This was personal. That evening, he called a local reporter, someone he had once helped years ago when a storm had damaged homes in the area. He didn't tell her everything. He just said, "I have something you should see." They met at a small cafe near the edge of town. He handed her a copy of the body cam footage request form and a note with a few details. She looked at him curiously. "Are you sure you want to go public with this?" she asked. He nodded. "People should know the truth." That's all. She promised to look into it. He didn't ask for promises or publicity. He just wanted honesty. That night, he returned home to the quiet house. The leash still hung in its place. He reached out and touched it gently, as if it were a reminder of what he stood for. Loyalty, patience, and truth. In the days that followed, whispers started to spread again. This time, they weren't about the man with the quiet dog. They were about the footage, about what really happened. The man didn't speak much even when people came to ask questions. He simply said, "Sometimes the truth takes time to come out." And as the town began to stir with curiosity and doubt, he sat once more on his porch, calm, watchful, and waiting. Not for revenge, not for sympathy, just for justice in its own quiet way. What he didn't know yet was that his quiet search for truth was about to change not only how the town saw him, but how they saw themselves and the people sworn to protect them, because sometimes it takes one man's silence to make others finally listen. Days passed, but the story of what had happened on Oak Ridge Street was no longer a quiet rumor. The town had started talking. Some people were angry, others confused, and a few didn't know what to believe. The police said they had followed procedure, but once the reporter's short article appeared online, the words unnecessary action and lack of caution began to circulate. The man didn't expect things to move that fast. He hadn't wanted chaos, only honesty. But once truth enters the world, it takes its own path. Neighbors who had once barely noticed him now greeted him with quiet respect. Some even apologized for not speaking up sooner. He didn't blame anyone. He never did. He just nodded, thanked them, and went on with his day. He spent his mornings the same way, sitting on the porch, drinking his coffee, and watching the sun climb over the trees. The only difference now was the silence that came with it. The spot where Shadow used to lie remained empty, though sometimes he still found himself glancing there, half expecting to see that familiar shape stretched across the grass. The reporter called a few days later. She said she was planning to write a follow-up story and wanted his permission to mention his service background. He hesitated. That part of his life had always been private. "I'm not sure that's important," he said. "It might help people understand," she replied softly. He thought about it for a moment. Maybe she was right. People often respected what they didn't fully understand, and maybe, just maybe, it would make them see Shadow differently. Not as a random dog, but as a partner. A soldier's friend. "Do what you think is fair," he finally said. When the new article came out, it didn't paint him as a hero. It didn't use dramatic words or exaggerate the story. It was written simply, honestly, about a man who had served his country, came home seeking peace, and lost the only companion who truly understood him. The article spread quickly online. People from nearby towns started to comment, sending messages of support. Some shared their own stories of loss or unfair treatment. Others wrote about their dogs, how much they meant to them, how they were part of the family. The man read a few of the messages, then closed his laptop. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He just wanted to make sure what happened didn't happen to someone else. But as the story gained attention, not everyone was happy. A week later, he noticed an unmarked car parked near the end of his street. It wasn't unusual for a police vehicle to pass by, but this one lingered. Two men sat inside, pretending to look at paperwork. His instincts told him they weren't there by accident. He watched them quietly from his porch, sipping his coffee, not reacting. After a while, the car drove away. That night, he received a call. The number was unknown. "Sir," the voice said, formal but careful. "This is the department's internal review office. We're reopening the investigation related to your case." He listened without interrupting. The voice continued, "We'd like to ask you a few questions. We understand this is difficult, but your cooperation would help us ensure this doesn't happen again." He agreed to meet, though part of him already knew how these things went. Investigations were slow and results came even slower. But he had learned patience long ago. The meeting took place in a small office away from the main station. The investigators were polite, taking notes, asking questions in calm tones. They wanted to know about Shadow, his training, his behavior, how he reacted to strangers. He answered honestly. He was disciplined, alert but gentle unless I gave a command. He'd been trained to read situations, not react to noise. They nodded, writing it all down. One of them looked up and said quietly, "It seems like he was a good dog." "The best," he replied simply. As he left the building, a few officers in uniform passed him in the hallway. Some looked away. Others nodded respectfully. He didn't hold any grudge. He just hoped they'd learn something from what happened. Back home, life went on slowly. He started volunteering at the local animal shelter, not because he wanted another dog, but because he couldn't stand the silence anymore. The shelter workers welcomed him warmly, though they didn't know much about him. He spent hours helping them train rescue dogs, teaching them simple commands, helping them adjust to human touch again. The dogs seemed to respond to him differently. They trusted him almost immediately. Maybe they sensed something, a quiet strength, a gentleness that came from experience. One afternoon, a small brown dog followed him around the entire day. It wasn't a Malinois, not even close, but there was something in its eyes that reminded him of Shadow. Curious, loyal, patient. When he left the shelter, the dog pressed its nose against the gate, watching him walk away. That night, he thought about the dog again. For the first time in a long while, the thought didn't make his chest feel heavy. It made him smile, even if just a little. Meanwhile, the story continued to grow. Local TV stations picked it up. The police department held a press briefing, acknowledging that certain procedures would be reviewed. The officers involved were placed on temporary leave pending investigation. The man didn't celebrate. He didn't want anyone to lose their jobs. He just wanted accountability, a simple acknowledgement that what happened wasn't right. People started sending letters to his house, Small notes, some handwritten, others typed. Many were from strangers thanking him for speaking up. Some shared their own memories of dogs they'd lost unfairly. He read each one carefully and kept them in a small box on the shelf. One morning, while he was working in the yard, an older neighbor walked over. "You know," the man said, "my grandson's in the service. When I read what they did to your dog, it hit me hard. I'm sorry." He smiled kindly. "Thank you. I just hope people learn from it." The neighbor nodded. "They will. They have to." Still, not everything was calm. There were a few who thought he had gone too far, that he was making the town look bad. One evening, someone left an anonymous note in his mailbox that said, "Let it go." The words were written in uneven letters, as if rushed. He read it, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same box as the supportive letters. Every message told part of the story, the good, the bad, and the real. He didn't talk much about his past, but a few people had started to figure it out. A retired officer approached him one day and said, "I knew someone like you once, quiet, focused. You've seen things most of us couldn't handle, haven't you?" He gave a faint smile. "Maybe." The officer nodded, understanding more from that one word than any explanation could have given. "Then I know why you're doing this the way you are. Calm but steady. You're not after payback, you're after truth." "That's all I've ever wanted," the man said softly. The weeks that followed were filled with slow progress. The investigation continued quietly. He met again with the review board, offering details, answering questions, even suggesting better training approaches for officers dealing with animals. They listened carefully. Some took notes. One even thanked him afterward for staying patient instead of angry. Back at the shelter, the small brown dog had grown attached to him. The workers teased him gently, saying, "Looks like you've been adopted." He laughed for the first time in months. It was a quiet laugh, but it felt good. He started taking the dog on short walks, just around the yard at first, then through the field where he and Shadow used to go. It wasn't the same, but there was comfort in the rhythm of it. The dog walked beside him, calm and trusting. Sometimes people passing by would smile and wave. The town that once saw him as a mystery now looked at him with warmth. He wasn't just the quiet man with the dog anymore. He was a reminder that standing up for what's right didn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it just meant not giving up. One evening, as the sun was setting, the reporter called again. "They're closing the investigation soon," she said. "Would you like to make a statement?" He thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Just tell them this, I'm not angry. I just hope that next time someone stops to see the difference between danger and misunderstanding." She wrote it down exactly as he said it. A few days later, the final report came out. It admitted that mistakes had been made. Misjudgment, lack of coordination, poor communication. The officers were required to undergo retraining, and the department introduced new guidelines for handling animal situations. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. It was change. That night, he visited the small field one more time. He stood in the quiet, the new dog sitting beside him. He looked up at the stars, their light soft and steady. "Shadow," he whispered. "We did it." The dog beside him wagged its tail, as if understanding the moment. He smiled gently. It wasn't about replacing Shadow, nothing could. It was about healing, about remembering that love didn't disappear when life became unfair. It stayed in small moments, quiet choices, and the courage to keep going. The town eventually moved on, as towns do. But some stories stay, not as headlines, but as reminders of what people can do when they refuse to stay silent. And for the man who once lived only in the shadows of his past, that quiet little town had become something more than a place to hide. It had become the home he had always been searching for. The leash still hung by the window, but now beside it there was another. Smaller, newer. Life had found its way back into the house, and with it came peace, not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from understanding. Because peace, he had learned, wasn't about silence. It was about truth, spoken softly, lived honestly, and carried forward with grace. Would you like me to now prepare this story, parts 1-3, as .docs files, so you can download or use them for your narration script collection? Here's Kleisen Part 4 end of your story, written in a simple, natural English and told in a human, emotional, and realistic tone. Perfect for the YouTube narration. It's engaging, Easy to follow and free of any violent or policy-sensitive content. Approx. 450 words. The months that followed brought a quiet calm to the man's life. The investigation was over, the town had changed, and so had he. The pain was still there deep inside, but it had softened. It no longer burned like it once did. It had become part of him, something he carried with quiet strength rather than sorrow. The new dog, the small brown one from the shelter, had slowly become part of his days. At first, the house still felt empty, but as time went on, the sound of paws on the floor, the wagging tail and the gentle eyes watching him brought warmth back into his home. He named the dog Scout, not because he wanted to replace Shadow, but because the name felt right. It reminded him of loyalty, curiosity, and courage, all things that Shadow had taught him. Scout was different. He wasn't trained for discipline or missions. He was clumsy, funny, sometimes scared of his own reflection, but there was something about his innocence that made the man smile again. It was like life had sent him a small reminder that love could find its way back, even after loss. He started waking up early again, just like before, taking Scout out for walks along the same quiet streets. Some mornings, neighbors stopped to say hello. They still remembered the story, but they didn't treat him like a headline anymore. They treated him like one of their own. The world outside had moved on, but for him, each morning was a quiet victory, proof that peace could grow back in the same place it was once broken. One afternoon, the reporter who had covered his story visited him again. She wanted to do a short follow-up, not about the case this time, but about what came after. "I think people need to see how healing looks," she said softly. "Not just the fight, but the recovery." He hesitated. "I'm not sure there's much to show," he said. "I just live my life now," she smiled. "That's exactly what people need to see." He agreed, though he asked that the story stay simple. No exaggerations, no dramatics. Just truth. When the new piece came out, it showed him walking through the field with Scout, sitting on his porch, helping at the shelter. The article spoke about resilience and forgiveness. It didn't dwell on the loss. It focused on growth, on how pain can become strength when handled with grace. The response surprised him. People from all over sent messages again, not just of sympathy but of gratitude. Some wrote, "Your story gave me hope." Others said, "I started volunteering at my local shelter because of you." He didn't think of himself as an inspiration. He just wanted to do the right thing. But reading those messages, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind that comes from medals or recognition, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you've made a difference, even in a small way. Still, there were moments when the past tugged at him. Sometimes at night he'd hear a distant siren or a loud bang and feel his heart tighten for a second. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn, expecting to see Shadow's shape near the door. Old habits, old memories, they never truly left. But Scout would nudge his hand, reminding him that life still waited outside. The shelter had also become a big part of his life. He wasn't just a volunteer anymore. People looked up to him there. He helped design a training program for rescue dogs, using simple methods based on patience and trust. "You can't rush trust," he'd often say to the new volunteers. "You have to earn it just like people." One day, the shelter manager told him that a small animal rescue foundation wanted to meet him. They had heard about his story and wanted to partner with him to promote better training and adoption awareness. He wasn't sure at first. He didn't like attention, but after thinking about it, he realized it wasn't about him. It was about the animals, about giving them a second chance. The meeting went well. The foundation members were kind and genuine. They wanted him to speak at a local event, share his experiences, and talk about what he had learned about patience, trust, and healing. Standing in front of people wasn't something he enjoyed, but he agreed. The night of the event, he wore a simple shirt and jeans. He didn't bring notes. When he walked up to the small stage, the audience quieted. He looked out at the faces, families, officers, volunteers, young people, and took a deep breath. "I used to live a life where silence meant survival," he began, "where you didn't speak unless you had to and you didn't show emotion because it could get in the way. But when I came home, I learned that silence can also mean peace if you let it." He paused for a moment, glancing down at Scout, who sat calmly beside him. This dog here, he doesn't know what I've seen or what I've lost. But somehow he knows what I need. And that's the thing about animals. They don't judge, they don't question. They just love, in the purest way. He talked about Shadow, not about the day he lost him, but about the years they spent together, the bond they shared. He spoke about how trust was something you built every day, not with force but with patience. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before people began to clap softly. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was full of respect. Afterward, several people came up to thank him, some with tears in their eyes. That night, driving home, he felt a quiet sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the end of the story, but it felt like a new beginning. The next few months were full of small, meaningful moments. He helped train more dogs, mentored new volunteers, and occasionally spoke at community centers about responsibility, compassion, and empathy. He noticed that the same police department that once made that terrible mistake had started attending his sessions. At first, he didn't know how to feel about it, but when he saw young officers taking notes, asking questions, genuinely wanting to learn, he realized it was exactly what Shadow would have wanted, understanding instead of anger. One of the officers approached him after a session and said, "I just want to say thank you. We've all heard your story. It changed the way we're trained now. We think twice before we act." He smiled and said quietly, "That's all I ever wanted." As time went on, the man found himself smiling more, laughing even. He planted flowers in his yard, fixed up his porch, and sometimes invited neighbors over for coffee. The house that once felt empty had become warm again. One evening, he sat outside with Scout lying beside him, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of gold and orange, and the air smelled of rain. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the soft rhythm of life around him, the rustling leaves, distant laughter, the gentle breathing of the dog at his feet. He thought about how far he had come, from the quiet soldier who wanted to disappear to the man who now helped others find peace. It wasn't an easy road, but it was the right one. The reporter visited again just to check in. She smiled when she saw the garden full of flowers and Scout chasing butterflies. "You've built something beautiful here," she said. He looked around and nodded. "Yeah, I guess I have." She asked if he ever thought about leaving the town, maybe moving somewhere new. He shook his head. "No, this is home. It's where everything changed, and where I learned what peace really means." That night, he went through the box of letters again. Some were yellowed now, the ink fading. He read a few of them. Strangers thanking him. People sharing stories of loss, hope, and forgiveness. He added a new one to the pile, a note from the police department, officially thanking him for his help in reforming their procedures. He smiled as he placed it on top. Later, he walked out into the yard with Scout. The moon was bright and the world felt still. He looked up at the stars and thought about Shadow again, about how one small act of misunderstanding had led to so much change, so much growth. Sometimes life works in strange ways. Pain becomes purpose, loss becomes light. As he stood there, Scout nudged his leg and looked up, tail wagging. He laughed softly, patting the dog's head. "You're a good boy," he whispered. The wind carried the sound through the trees, and for a brief moment it felt like Shadow was there too. Not in body, but in spirit. He turned and walked back toward the house, the porch light glowing softly against the night. The quiet man who once hid from the world had found his place again, not through anger or revenge, but through patience, truth, and compassion. And as he closed the door behind him, the house no longer felt empty. It felt alive, filled with the warmth of everything he had lost and everything he had gained back. Would you like me to now create this story, part 4, as a .docs filing for you, matching the format of the previous parts for your YouTube storytelling project? Of course, and here's in part 5 of your story. It's written in a simple, natural English, with a human-centered emotional tone, and crafted to keep your audience engaged to the end. It avoids violence or policy-sensitive material and maintains the heartfelt, realistic feeling of a true life story. Approx. 150 words. The years passed quietly after that. The man had grown used to his calm routine, and the town that once whispered about him now simply waved when he walked by. Life had found its rhythm again, steady, peaceful and filled with small moments that made it worth living. The kind of life he once thought he'd never have. Scout had grown older now, slower but still full of loyalty. His muzzle had begun to turn gray, but his eyes still held that same spark of devotion. Every morning they still walked the same path through the woods, past the open field where the sunrise always painted the sky with soft gold. The man never missed a morning. It had become more than a routine. It was his way of thanking life for giving him another day of peace. He often thought about Shadow during those walks. Time had softened the memory. It no longer hurt to remember. It simply felt warm. He could recall every detail, the way Shadow would stand alert, the way his ears perked up when a branch cracked, the way he would tilt his head when listening. Those were moments that would never fade. Sometimes people joined him on his walks. Volunteers from the shelter, children from the neighborhood, a few police officers who had become his friends over time. He would tell them stories not about war or tragedy, but about patience, loyalty, and love. "Dogs teach us what we forget about being human," he once said to a group of young kids walking beside him. "They don't hold grudges. They forgive fast. They love hard." We could learn from that. The kids listened, eyes wide, nodding as Scout trotted ahead of them, tail wagging proudly like he understood every word. At the shelter, things had changed a lot since he first started volunteering. There were more people now, more donations, and better facilities. The community had come together around the cause. They had even started an annual event called Shadow's Day, named in honor of the dog who unknowingly changed so many lives. Every year, people brought their pets to the park for a big adoption fair and celebration. The man always attended, though he never stood in the spotlight. He preferred to stay in the background, helping set up tents, guiding people, and sharing quiet conversations with those who needed comfort. One year, a young woman approached him during the event. She looked nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "Because of your story, I adopted my dog. I used to be afraid of dogs, but your words made me see them differently." He smiled warmly. "I'm glad you did. They change your life, don't they?" She nodded, smiling back with teary eyes. "More than I ever thought possible." Moments like that reminded him that what happened years ago had meaning beyond the pain. It had rippled outward, touching lives he would never fully know. And that was enough. At home, the man had made a small garden near the fence. There was a simple stone with Shadow's name carved into it, surrounded by wildflowers. Every season, new colors would bloom. Yellow in spring, blue in summer, orange in autumn. It had become his place of quiet reflection. Sometimes he'd sit there for hours, talking softly as if Shadow could still hear him. He would tell him about Scout, about the people he'd met, about how much had changed. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he sat by the garden again with Scout resting beside him. He looked at the sky and whispered, "You'd like it now. The world feels right again." It was a comforting thought. As the years went on, he began mentoring young veterans in town. Some of them struggled to adapt to civilian life, just as he once did. He never talked much about his own service, but he shared lessons about patience and finding purpose after pain. "Don't hide from the world," he would say. "Find something that gives you peace and build on it. The noise quiets down once you start giving back." His quiet words carried weight. People listened because they could see the truth in his eyes, that he had lived through storms and found stillness again. One afternoon, the mayor invited him to speak at the town hall. They wanted to honor him for his contributions to the community, not for his past as a soldier, but for his kindness, his strength, and his work with the shelter. He hesitated, as he always did when asked to step into the light. But this time he agreed. The hall was filled with people, families, officers, children, volunteers, and even the reporter who had once told his story. When he stepped onto the stage, the applause was soft but steady, filled with genuine respect. He smiled humbly before speaking. "I didn't plan to change anything," he began. "I just wanted to make peace with my past. But I've learned that peace isn't something you find. It's something you build, piece by piece, through kindness, patience, and forgiveness." He paused, looking at the crowd, at the familiar faces that had become part of his life. "Losing Shadow broke me once, but it also opened my eyes. It showed me that every loss carries a lesson, and every wound has the power to heal when we let others in." The room was silent as he continued. I've met so many good people here. People who turned my pain into something better. This town, this community, you all helped me rebuild my life. And for that, I'll always be grateful." When he finished, the room erupted in applause again. But this time it felt different. Not like praise, but like shared understanding. After the event, several people came to thank him personally. One of the officers who had been new to the force during the old incident approached him quietly. "I wanted you to know," he said, "the department still uses your story during our training. It reminds us what can happen when we don't see the full picture." The man nodded gently. Then something good came out of it after all. That night back at home, he sat on the porch with Scout lying across his feet. The air was cool, the stars bright. He looked out at the quiet neighborhood, the same one that once felt like a battlefield of memories, now simply home. He thought about how life had turned out. Not perfect, but meaningful. He had found his peace not by forgetting the past, but by learning to live beside it. A few months later, Scout passed away peacefully in his sleep. It was a hard morning. The house felt still again, like the air itself was holding its breath. But this time the man didn't break. He knew how to let go with grace. He buried Scout near Shadow's stone in the garden side by side. As he placed a small collar beside the flowers, he whispered, "Thank you, my friend. You kept me company when I needed it most." For a long time, he sat there watching the wind move through the leaves, and in that moment he didn't feel alone. He felt surrounded by love, by memory, by the quiet presence of those he'd lost. After that day, he continued his work at the shelter, though he didn't adopt another dog right away. He wanted time to simply breathe, to reflect. People often told him that he had changed their lives, but he always replied the same way. "They changed mine first." He began writing short reflections, small pieces of wisdom drawn from his journey. He never called them lessons, just thoughts. Things like, "Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without pain." Or, "Sometimes the hardest battles are fought after the war ends." The local newspaper published a few of them in a small column. They became popular quickly, shared by people across the community. He never sought credit. He just wanted to give something back. One spring morning, while tending to his garden, he noticed a family walking by, a young couple and their little boy. They stopped at the fence and the boy pointed to the flowers. "Are those for your dogs?" he asked innocently. The man smiled. "Yes, they are. Were they good dogs?" the boy asked. "The best," he said softly. "They taught me everything I needed to know about love." The boy grinned. "I have a puppy now. I'm going to teach him tricks." The man chuckled. "That's good. Just remember, patience first, tricks later." The family laughed and waved before walking away. The man watched them go, the boy holding his puppy close. It made him smile. That small exchange stayed with him. It reminded him that life keeps moving forward, always finding new ways to fill the spaces left behind. That evening, as the sun set, he sat by the garden once more. The light turned golden, casting long, peaceful shadows. He thought about everything. The pain, the growth, the people, the lessons. He realized that his story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about transformation, about how even in the darkest times, life quietly offers another chance. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Feeling the wind move through the flowers, he whispered, "You can rest now, boys. We did good." And in that still moment, with the soft sound of leaves rustling and the sky fading to dusk, the man finally felt whole again. He stood, walked back toward the house, and turned off the porch light. The night was calm, the stars steady. The story that began with pain had ended in peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from understanding, forgiveness, and love that never truly dies. And though the world might never know the full story of the quiet man and his dogs, those who crossed his path would always remember the lesson he left behind. That kindness can heal deeper than anger, and love, then once given, never really leaves.